The Kalb Report is funded by a grant from the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is the Kalb Report with Marvin Kalb.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb. Our program tonight we're calling Guardians of the Fourth Estate, and our guardians are our guests. Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the New York Times, and Martin Baron, the executive editor of the Washington Post. Arguably the two most influential editors of the two most influential newspapers in the country. Dean Baquet has been in this job since 2014, having earlier served as managing editor and Washington bureau chief of the Times. He also edited the Los Angeles Times, won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting for the Chicago Tribune, and started his newspaper career way back when as a young journalist at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans. Martin Baron, Marty to most of his friends, joined the Washington Post in 2013 after 11 years editing the Boston Globe. Both papers, under his leadership, harvested 12 Pulitzer Prizes. Baron also in earlier times helped edit the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and the Miami Herald. Allow me to start our discussion tonight with a simple proposition that in a democracy such as ours, if freedom of the press is jeopardized, then democracy itself is jeopardized, since one is intimately linked to the other. During the presidential campaign of 2016, candidate Donald Trump routinely criticized the press or the media, humiliating a number of reporters, bullying others, challenging the very concept of freedom of the press as written into the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Many said this was all campaign talk. If he won, this would inevitably change. That is the way it has always been. Well, he won, and it has not changed. Indeed, it has gotten much worse, even on occasion frightening, and I use that word deliberately. The word of a president is much more consequential than the word of a candidate. I know that other presidents have had their quarrels with the media, but Donald Trump crossed a bright red line when he accused reporters of being the enemies of the American people, forgetting that that phrase was a favorite of many 20th century dictators. And Trump has gone further, warning that he might change libel laws, that reporters might have to reveal their sources on sensitive national security stories or risk imprisonment, even warning networks such as NBC that their licenses to broadcast may be revoked if their news stories displease the White House, stories called fake news. What is President Trump seeking to accomplish in this running war with the media? And what should the press's response really be? So, Dean, Marty, welcome. Good to have you both with us. How does one cover a President Trump in a wild era of expanding digital horizons? How do you do that without, at the same time, perhaps undercutting your own traditional standards of mainstream journalism? Dean, start us, please.
First off, you hold on to your standards of journalism. I mean, I think there are bedrock standards which are the obvious ones: truth, fairness, that good journalists are aggressive, skeptical. I think you hold on to those things, and obviously, you have to cover him, as we would any president, by the way, at a remarkable speed. And with him, you have to dodge the fact that, yes, all the things you opened up with are true. I mean, I think that he has sought to undermine the press. And I think that's an attempt to appeal to his base by making the press look like it's not fair, and by turning the press sort of into a punching bag. I think over the long haul, if you tell the truth, if you're accurate, if you're aggressive and you're fair and you hold on to your principles, I think in the end that's the only way you can cover him.
Marty, I'm sure you agree with all of that.
Yeah.
But the question that I'm getting at, I'm trying to get at, is this president has a way, a very skillful way, of dominating the environment. He's all over the place.
Sure.
And he does that with his tweets, he does that with his personality, his style. How do you keep up with that kind of domination of the environment? Do you have enough reporters? Do you have to stick to your basic rules, as Dean was saying before, and still be able to cover him?
Well, I think so. I mean, I agree with Dean. I think that, look, we have new ways of publishing. We publish at a greater speed. We publish not just 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but now we have to publish immediately. People expect to get their news immediately, typically on their cell phone, the instant that it happens. That all poses challenges to us. But we still have our values. We still have our mission. That remains the same. And, you know, every day when I walk into our newsroom, we have the principles of the Washington Post on the wall facing me. And the very first principle, which has been around there for more than 8 decades, and that is to tell the truth as nearly as the truth may be ascertained. And, you know, there's a sense of striving there because the truth may be elusive, can be elusive, but it says that there is such a thing as the truth. It's not just a matter of personal opinion. There is a truth, and our job is to come in every day, do our job, do our work, and try to determine the truth. And that is exactly what we do. It's nothing fancy. It's our work, the same work that we've been doing for decades.
You use the word truth. This is a president who has been violating the truth almost on a daily basis. We use the word lie now routinely to describe many of the things that a president of the United States is saying. Now, you have your standards, and in my judgment, they're the right standards. But how do you maintain them when the man you're covering isn't dealing with the truth on many occasions, Dean?
You know, I actually chose to use the word lie on the front page of the New York Times, which was a controversial decision in our newsroom, and I actually think that a lot of thoughtful editors would disagree with it. But we don't do it all the time. We did it that one time. I think the way you cover him is if he says X and if it's wrong, you report out Y. I think one thing Marty said is true. I think you report aggressively, and I think you sort of lay out the facts. I think that's what we've been doing since I started as a reporter in 1977. I don't think it's different. I think it's faster. I think it's even more aggressive. We have done things, newspapers have done things like set up whole truth squad operations. We no longer wait the way we did when I started for 2 or 3 days to evaluate whether a politician is telling the truth. We try to do it immediately. We set up systems to do it immediately. On the other hand, I have to say, it's sometimes easier to check things today. I mean, the internet may have perils, but it also has great gifts.
It's hard to check a lie that quickly, isn't it?
You know, if the president says that he cut a program by $500 million, I don't think that's
No, that's easy.
That's easy, and that's actually 90% of the things I think you're talking about. That's sort of easy. You just challenge them and you report them out and you lay it out.
Marty, when the president dismisses some of your best reporting as fake news, and when, according to many polls, from 30 to 40% of the American people are buying into that description, how do you deal with that? How do you fight back?
Well, look, we do our job. That's
No,
it.
but that's
I mean, I don't think it's too facile. I'm sorry. I realize that you're, looking for something more, but I don't think that there's a lot more to it. Every day, look, the president, on his first day in office, he went to the CIA headquarters and he said, I have a war with the press. And the reality is, we don't have a war with him. We're not at war, we're at work. We're doing our jobs every day the same way that we've always done it. You talk about fact-checking. We've had a fact-checker at the Washington Post for a long time, well before the Trump administration. In fact, we doubled the size. We added an extra person. We have 2 people now doing it. And they've been doing fact-checks for a long time. They happen to be a little busier these days than they were in the past, I have to say. But they're doing the same sort of work every single day. And the very fact that the president is attacking us doesn't change things. We can't just be reactive to that. We have to go out, gather the facts, provide the context, do it in an honorable and honest way, and that's what we endeavor to do every single day.
What is then different about covering Trump?
Well, it's a more hostile environment. There's no question about that. He was attacking us during the campaign regularly, even withdrew press credentials from the Washington Post during the primary and then for a time during the general election as well. And he condemned us. He sought to he condemned us. He sought to delegitimize us. He even dehumanized us, calling us the scum and garbage, the lowest form of humanity. And then when that wasn't enough, he called us the lowest form of life itself. He sought to dehumanize us. And so that's different. He's also threatened us in the way of sort of talking about the possibility of litigation against us, suggesting, as has been reported by us in the New York Times, in his conversations with the former FBI director, the prospect of wanting to send some reporters to jail for leaks, particularly for classified information leaks. So, this is what's different. It's a more threatening and more hostile environment.
If I can add,
go ahead, Dean. I'm sorry.
I agree with Marty. If I can add, it's also a significant shift in the culture of Washington. There's always been a tense relationship between. It's a myth that. I was the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times for 5 years, and I never met Barack Obama the entire time I was the Washington bureau chief. There was a notion that papers like the Post and the New York Times had a cozier relationship. I don't actually want to have a cozy relationship with any president. I don't go to the Christmas parties. I don't go to the White House Correspondents' Dinner. I don't think that's but he's turned up the volume, there's no question, on and dramatically changed the culture of Washington. But I actually think, and I know this is not the sexiest answer, but I actually think that calls for us to stick to our principles even more. That calls for us to hold on to sort of the values, the fairness, the toughness, but especially to sort of there are these traditional journalism standards that I think have been threatened in some institutions in the digital age, even before the arrival of Donald Trump. And if anything, I think the last year has been a call to hold on to those and to hold on to them tightly.
Okay, I want to tell you a story. Back in 1947, when Jackie Robinson broke the baseball barrier on color, he still faced a great deal of prejudice, and he got into a lot of fights. And his boss, Branch Rickey, pulled him aside one day and said, "Jackie, don't punch back, just beat them on the field." Turn that into journalism now. How do you adjust to the almost daily taunts and jabs and insults of the president without punching back? You're all making it seem, both of you, as if it's sort of the same, your principles are the same, you don't touch, everything is honky-dory. But it can't be.
I don't think that's true. I think that we've come to expect it. It happens every other day, maybe every day. It's become, to some degree, background music, and it's not pleasant background music, but it's background music. And if we were to react to this every single day, get all worked up about it, and spend our time sort of, making an issue out of it all the time, we wouldn't be able to do our jobs. If that's what he wants to do, that's what he wants to do. We know what we want to do. Right. We want to do our jobs, and that's what we're going to continue to do.
All right, Dean, you know, I know, everybody in this room knows that there are people who argue that the two of you, New York Times and the Washington Post, are in a kind of unseemly competition
We talk
to
every
topple
morning.
this president, to topple this president, to pull another Watergate.
Yeah.
And what I would like to know from you is, how do you respond to that kind of criticism, which is not widespread, but
Yeah.
it's there?
I mean, I would say two things. First, Marty and I are friends, in fact, but we have a tremendous, the only competition is between us. It's not a competition to topple the presidency. There is one thing I sincerely believe is that I do agree that the Washington Post and the New York Times are at the forefront of this story right now. I cannot imagine what it would be like if it was only one of us, because it would mean that the other newspaper would be under tremendous pressure. But I will say that one of the most under-discussed and undervalued qualities in journalism that drives much more journalism than anybody realizes is competition. I hate it when I get beat. He hates it when he gets beat. The thought that we could collude to do anything is utterly ridiculous, except obviously we could collude to fight for our values. We could collude to talk about the First Amendment. But the thought that we would be anything other than friendly and admiring but vicious competitors, well, he's vicious, competitors.
What, Marty, I would like.
Dean has told me about, I mean, it's better that both of us are in there, but I've invited him to cede the territory to us. So we can test it, see how it goes without the New York
What I
Times.
would like to get your judgment on, both of you really, is when the president keeps attacking the press, what is his ultimate aim? What is he seeking to accomplish? You said before, playing to his base. Fine. Is that it? Is that all he's trying to accomplish?
Well, I will fall short of psychoanalyzing him, but I think if you looked at Donald Trump's pattern through the campaign, and as president, first off, he clearly goes after his critics, and I think he goes after, in particular, critics and people who have independent standing, which the press certainly does. I mean, he early in his presidency went after the judiciary, and probably, arguably, the most independent and protected entities in society are the judiciary and the press. I think, first off, I think all presidents are really frustrated by the power of the press, by the fact that they can't tell us what to do, by the fact that we push, at our best, we push back at them hard. But I think for a guy who grew up in a world of business, I think it makes him nuts. He's also a guy, by the way, as a New Yorker who grew up manipulating the press. I mean, I think Page Six was his playground. He, famously announced his divorce on Page Six before he told one of his wives. I think he arrives in Washington at the pinnacle of it all, and here are these jerks, the press, who push and push and push and do our jobs.
You don't see a larger political purpose,
I mean,
some ideology being served here.
I mean, there's the obvious one, which is that he plays to a base that generally may not believe the press anyway. But I think some of it is personal frustration. I mean, his MO in New York was to manipulate the press, and he got his way with the press, mainly the tabloids.
But is it possible?
So part of it is strategic.
No, I hear you.
But part of it, I think, is just a guy who suddenly finds himself confronting a very different kind of press than he confronted when he lived in the world of tabloid journalism in New York.
Is it possible that by attacking the press, by creating this sense of fake news, by delegitimizing among an X% of the American people what it is that you do for a living, that he may succeed, that at the end of the day, his vision of this all may triumph? Do you think that's possible? And two, what would then happen? What is the price of letting this happen?
Look, I mean, it has a corrosive effect, I think. There's no question about it. He's obviously saying something that appeals to a large segment of the American population. Approval ratings for the press were quite low, have continued to go down over decades. That's true, actually, of most institutions, major institutions in American society. We have the not great distinction of being a little ahead of Congress on that front. But you know, the polls have shown a sharp decline, a significant decline, particularly in the last year, in approval of the presidency as well, to the point where our standing and the presidency's standing are beginning to intersect.
Really?
If you actually look at the polls more recently, we've actually begun to see a little uptick in the standing of the press among the American public. And, you know, people see us doing our work. And my view is that, you know, we have to look at this over the long run. I mean, will the reporting be validated over the long run? If you go back to Watergate, for example, and I'm not making an analogy here, but we had a president at that time who was sharply critical of the press, whose first vice president, Spiro Agnew, before he had resigned, was the designated attack dog, embraced that role. The approval ratings for the press during the Watergate investigation were very low. A huge segment of the American population saw that as a partisan enterprise. And then it turned out that that reporting was validated. And the approval ratings for the press after Nixon's resignation went sharply up to the highest point we've seen, which is not always so high. I mean, maybe the mid-50s is about as high as we'll ever get because we're always going to upset somebody. So I take the long view of this. The reporting needs to be solid. Ultimately, I believe, I'm confident that the reporting will be validated over time. And I take the long view of our standing among the American public.
Dean, if trust be lost, to whatever degree, how does one reconstitute trust? How do you gain back the confidence of the American people that what you spend an awful lot of time and money doing is valuable, is important? How do you sell that again?
I mean, I may be naive, but I actually think that when the press does its job, and does its job, which is to be an aggressive, questioning watchdog of government, even if it drops, it comes back. Press does its job, Vietnam, Watergate. Press didn't do its job as well, build up to the Iraq War. I think when the press does its job and is aggressive, even if it temporarily loses trust, if it holds on to its values, I think history is filled with examples of where it comes back. I just think as long as you get it right, as long as you stand up to power, as long as you aggressively question, as long as you hold on to all of that, I just don't think you lose. And I think history is behind us on that.
And you don't feel, neither one of you, that the combination of presidential taunt, perhaps actual action against you, an atmosphere that gets clouded with doubt and suspicion, that is a tough thing to fight.
Action makes me more nervous because we haven't gotten into the realm of action. I mean, if this White House, for instance, I mean, remember, the last White House was not so nice to the press when it came to leak investigations. If this White House chose to be more aggressive, that would be bad, and that would be something we would have to fight. If this president, I mean, I'm not sure I buy the licensing issue, but I think if this president chooses to go after reporters, and Jeff Sessions has said, the Attorney General has said, he has open leak investigations, that makes me more nervous than, I mean, I think I'm with Marty. I think the taunts and the tweets have become background music. I mean, at a certain point, we would look at them and debate over how to respond. We don't. He did one 2 days ago at us, and we don't even respond anymore.
Well, let me give you a little bit of history before I ask this next question. But when I was covering Lyndon Johnson during the Vietnam War, there were a couple of occasions when he would call me on the phone, yell and curse, and accuse me of all kinds of horrors. And when those calls ended, I was a shaken leaf. It was tough. And then during the Nixon administration, I found myself on an enemies list. My office was broken into twice. The phone was tapped. And I worry, do any of your reporters, has anyone checked back to you with anything resembling that kind of activity against the press?
You mean shouting? Shouting,
Not the
yes.
shouting.
Shouting, yes.
Not the shouting.
Not
Get to
not
the-
an enemies list or anything like that I'm aware of. But I mean, you don't need an enemies list. I mean, you
Wiretapping?
just not aware of anything. No.
So even on the national security stories.
But we wouldn't necessarily, if it were
We wouldn't
occurring.
know. That's
I'm
one
not
of our
supposing that
problems.
it's happened. I don't have any evidence that it is, but we wouldn't know about that.
Okay. Tell me, what is, Dean, the single biggest challenge to your newspaper today?
If you'd asked me that 3 years ago, I might have said, the financial
Financial.
future. I don't feel, I mean, that's always a challenge. I don't feel threatened by that anymore. I really don't. I mean, I guess the single biggest challenge is, to my mind, is not just the New York Times. It's whether local news, which I think is in the middle of a crisis, whether the country can survive what I think is going to happen in the next 4 to 5 years, which is I think many local newspapers are going to go out of business. One challenge for me is I believe I have an obligation to make up for at least some of that. I even think I have an obligation to do what I can to even help some of those institutions survive. But if you ask me what's the biggest challenge facing journalism, if I can answer it that way, it's the inevitable decline and death of some of great local news organizations.
Marty, your sense, please?
My sense is that it's people have a very difficult time these days distinguishing what is true and what is not true. They're drawn to sources of information that affirm their pre-existing point of view, not just in terms of opinion, but they'll accept so-called information and so-called news that's coming from media outlets that deliberately spread false information and crackpot conspiracy theories. And people are open to those because somehow it conforms to their view of the world. And that's concerning because now we have a society. It used to be that we would disagree, and we should disagree, on policies and sort of what the analysis of events is, what the interpretation is, and what the prescription for solving our problems are. But we would agree on a baseline set of facts. We could actually agree on what happened yesterday. We could disagree about what to do about it. But now we can't even agree on what happened yesterday. And I think that is not just a challenge for the press, but a challenge for democracy. Because how do you have a healthy democracy and a well-functioning civil society if we cannot even agree on a baseline set of facts?
I almost feel like I have to go back to the first question I asked you, which is if you are dealing with a president who attempts to build up the concept of fake news, that only worsens your problem, right?
Oh, absolutely, no question.
And how does a newspaper today, you run the two biggest, best newspapers in the country, that is a huge problem, totally agree with you. How do you deal with it? What do you deal with? I mean, when you say, what I want to do is I want aggressive reporting, I want us to be honest, word this, that, and the other. Those are words. They are words of great importance, but is that it?
Well, there's a limit to what we can do. I mean, we don't have total power, obviously. So, contrary to what sometimes people say about us, we do have to do our jobs the way that we see them. But also, I think we can be more transparent about how we go about our work. Talk more about who we are and what we believe and how we go about our work. That's why we're
you're
here.
here.
We can tell people more about the backgrounds of the people who write for us and produce video for us and do our graphics and all of that. I think people are entitled to know who we are. They're entitled to know how to reach us. We can show more of the documents that we depend on in doing our reporting. We can disclose more, perhaps full transcripts or full audio of interviews that we've conducted. We can just be more open about that, and I think that would help. I don't pretend that that's going to entirely do the job, but it won't hurt, that's for sure, and it could help.
In fact, I think it helps a lot. one of the shocks to me when I was editor of the LA Times is that we did a focus group and people didn't, to my horror, people didn't know what datelines were. So if a story said, you know, the name Alyssa Rubin and it said Kabul, they thought that meant she made a lot of phone calls to Kabul. And I think we need to tell people that, you know, Alyssa Rubin has been covering wars in Afghanistan and Iraq for 20 years. Here's who she is. Here's what she looks like. Here's her background. And I think if you do that, I think our previous era of sort of distance from readers was not good for us. And I think we're learning now, as Marty said, to open the doors.
Dean, you mentioned a moment ago that 2-3 years ago, the financial issue might have been the major problem, but it isn't today. To the best of my knowledge, you've established a foundation in the newsroom to attract money to help you cover the news. How's that doing, by the way, and how much money have you collected?
We literally just started that. That's not why I feel more comfortable with the financial future of the New York Times. That's very brand new. I feel comfortable because over the last year, and this is one thing I would point to the people who say that news organizations like ours are being attacked and discredited. Both of our news organizations have seen dramatic rises in subscribers. I think people want to read strongly reported, well-reported journalism, and I think they're flocking to us.
So Trump has been wonderful for you.
It would depend. That's a complicated answer, but just to finish I think the most for my institution, and I suspect the same is true for Marty's, is the revolution in the economics of the great news organizations like ours is that suddenly we are much more dependent on readers than ever before. We're more dependent on readers than advertisers. I think that's just a remarkable and terrific development. I also think it ensures that institutions that are high quality will survive. So I mean, nobody's sanguine, but I'm more sanguine than I was 3 years ago.
Do you still make more money on advertisements in the hard news?
We now make more money on subscribers in print and online than we do in advertising. That's when I started in this business, and I'm sure when 80% of a newspaper's revenue came from advertising. It's not totally reversed, but it's moving in that direction. By the way, to be frank, I would much more want to be dependent on my readers than on advertisers. I think because readers demand quality, they demand all the things we're talking about. I think that's a great development.
Marty, you have an owner with deep pockets, Jeff Bezos. Does that mean that you have no financial problems at the Post?
No. But we're having a very good year for the very reasons that Dean mentioned. We're seeing a dramatic growth in subscribers. Earlier this year, we passed 1 million digital-only subscribers. That's in addition to the people who get digital access with their print newspaper subscription. So that was double what we had at the beginning of the year and triple what we had a year earlier. Wow. So we've seen tremendous growth, and that has had a dramatic impact on our financial picture. It's very beneficial for us, and we're having a quite good year. Jeff's objective is for us to create a sustainable business model for the Washington Post. We're not a charity. He doesn't treat us like a charity. And I'm very glad he doesn't treat us like a charity, because if he were to get tired of this charity, we would be in deep trouble. And what he wants to do is create a sustainable business model that will last for a very long time, many decades.
Have you done that as yet?
Well, as I said, we're having a very good year. Last year was our first profitable year in a very long time. And this year we're doing far better than we did last year.
I was saying a moment ago.
But that's not to say that all the issues are resolved. We still have a lot of things to work on, as does the New York Times. But we're in, as Dean said, the two of us are in better shape than major metropolitan newspapers around the country, and that does remain a huge crisis, the biggest crisis in the press in this country right now, financial crisis in the press.
I was joking before when I asked you whether Trump is good for business, but it occurs to me that maybe, I'm sure you've both thought about this extensively, maybe the reason that the subscription rates are going up is that people want to know more about a president who dominates the news.
Oh, sure.
And that gives you an opportunity to provide answers and insight into this new president.
So I think both of our institutions, both of our institutions were ready to take advantage of it, because frankly, not every news organization has seen the dramatic increases that the Post and the New York Times have seen. I don't think they were in a position. I think people come to us because they know we're covering them aggressively. But if I can say the thing I think Trump has done most, at least for me as a journalist, I think there was a period when newspapers sort of lost a little bit of their confidence. Our economics were more in turmoil. I'm talking about going, several years. Our economics were more in turmoil. There were debates in newsrooms about, not necessarily in the newsrooms, but in newspaper companies and in all news organizations about what did readers want and how do we give readers what they want, which is a very good debate. But debates like that always make you sort of a little anxious. I think that what we learned was they actually want what we do. And I feel more confident as an editor today than I have. I'm a confident guy anyway, but I feel significantly more confident today as an editor and more clear-eyed on what I'm supposed to do than I did 5 years ago.
I would add to that there's been a shift in the thinking among the American public as well. I think the American public took the press for granted for a very, very long time, and that's changed. People don't take the press for granted anymore. They have a better understanding of the role of the press in an American democracy, and I think that has helped us, is that people recognize today that they need quality journalism, and if they don't support quality journalism, by paying a very little amount of money, actually, if they don't support quality journalism, they will not get quality journalism.
But we're talking about quality journalism from two very distinctive news organizations, New York Times and Washington Post. You were mentioning, Dean, about the news organizations in the central part of America. Perhaps you were saying yourself that some of these may have to go out of business.
I think local news is in deep trouble. I think the financial model that the Post and the New York Times have managed their way through, which is the dramatic decline in print advertising, I think that a lot of these newspapers have cut their newsrooms to the point that it's hard for them to charge the kind of money that our news organizations charge. I think that there are entire sections of America that aren't covered. I grew up in a newspaper in New Orleans that is a terrific newspaper. I'm sure the staff is a tiny fraction of what it was. My guess is there are places like Mississippi and Alabama that don't cover their congressional delegations because they don't have Washington bureaus, they don't have Washington correspondents, and unless they're members of Congress or very powerful figures who become national figures. And I think those news organizations are struggling.
So what's the consequence of that?
The consequence of having entire parts of the country not covered by the way, there are other news organizations that will come in to take their place in some cases, but that's not happening yet for the most part. I think that's catastrophic. I think that it means that there are school boards right now making decisions with nobody watching. It means that there are budgets that are getting passed in places where the news organizations their staffs are too small to spend days going through their budget. I already think we're in the middle of a crisis that people have not woken up to.
Marty?
Well, I agree. Look, something like more than half the states the press in the state has no one in Washington actually covering their congressional delegation. Right. Nobody. In most states, perhaps the biggest paper in the state has maybe one or two people covering the state capitol, covering the governor, both houses of the state legislature, all of the government agencies, the politics and the policy, and they're expected maybe to do an investigative piece. It's not even possible to do the basics. There are school boards going uncovered, county commissions going uncovered, city councils going uncovered, a lot of things going uncovered. And forget about the other powerful institutions and powerful individuals in town who should be covered as well. So I think overall it leads to, number one, a lack of accountability, as Dean was making reference to, And I think a degradation in basically civil society at the local and regional and state level. And I think that's hugely concerning because who is going to step in to do that kind of work?
It also means, if I can say, when I was a reporter for the New York Times and spending most of my time in Washington, there was a stretch near the metro where there were like 8 or 9 newspaper boxes with all the regional newspapers. And if you got beat on a story, partly because all of them use wires and partly because a lot of them were competing on the stories, you'd walk past the Post, of course, but then the Sun, the Philadelphia Inquirer, each one was like a kick in the stomach. So by the time you got into I got back to the Washington Bureau, I was practically crawling.
Yes.
That's gone. I mean, the regional news organizations that are not, really not factors in this story the way they were.
Let me talk to you for a sec about social media and how journalists are dealing with social media, which, could be a blessing or a curse. I am not at all sure of that. But Dean, you recently announced some new guidelines on the use by your reporters of social media.
Yeah.
Why the concern? Why did you have to do that?
The first thing I should say about all of this, social media, the digital landscape, it's all actually great. I mean, we spend a lot of time as journalists sort of, hand-wringing and debating, and of course it's all hard, of course it's all perilous, but the big news organizations like mine have more readers than we ever had because we're just more people can access us. The reason we changed our social media policy was I thought it was too easy.
What did you change it to?
So we've always had a policy that said, essentially, journalists should not say anything on other platforms and on social media that they wouldn't say in the pages of the New York Times or on our various platforms. But to be frank, we weren't aggressive enough in sort of making it a front and center policy. So we had just announced a front and center policy, and the essence is don't say anything on Twitter or Facebook or any place else that you wouldn't say in the New York Times. Because I think there's an entire generation of journalists. We have encouraged them to have large followings. We've encouraged them to promote their stories. We've encouraged them to find audiences for their stories, and I want them to do all that. But I was worried that there may have been instances where people went too far in expressing their opinions. And we are in a time when the press is being poked by its enemies, pushed to be provocative. By the way, even television news does that. We're in a climate in which everybody wants everybody to say strong stuff, to have strong opinions, and it's really tempting. And what I wanted to do was to make clear that I don't want the temptation to lure any of our people into saying things that I thought were inappropriate.
Fair enough, but I remember when Abe Rosenthal was the editor of the New York Times, he would say that if a Times reporter want to appear on CBS, they can appear on CBS and leave the Times. He wouldn't allow it at all.
Yeah.
You now, you just said it, you want it to get out? Yeah.
That was
It's a publicity thing for you both.
Yes.
But on cable television...
And a transparency thing, too. But go
Okay,
ahead.
but on cable television, when a reporter for the Post, and I've seen many of them and many Times reporters, when you appear on Fox or on MSNBC, the environment itself screams a political point of view. Your reporter is asked to discuss the story that will be in tomorrow's Post. I'm not saying that the reporter goes beyond that. I'm saying that the environment suggests to any logical viewer that that reporter is hooked in with the left or the right. Now, how do you manage that? Can you have it both ways? Can you want the publicity without going along with the cost?
Well, I'm not sure I entirely accept your premise there. I mean, I think that our reporters can behave in a very professional manner in those environments, and that I mean, you're presupposing that just because they're there, they're assumed to have a particular political point of view, which I just
You don't see that at all?
I don't believe that that's the case. You'd have to point me to some specifics for me to look at. Look, I mean, we want our reporters to be out there. We have the people on our staffs deans too, they're authorities in their fields. They've spent a lot of time. They have experience. They have expertise. We want them to share that. We want them to be viewed as authorities, the authorities that they are. And these days, it's helpful if they make proper use of social media, and it's helpful if they're on television and radio, and that's where a lot of viewers are. So we would like to reach them. We would like them to be thinking about, for us, the Washington Post. And I don't think that they necessarily engage in risky behavior simply because they're appearing on the air.
Quite
By
the
the way-
contrary. I specifically said that I am not at all criticizing the reporters.
And I'm not sure that they're perceived as such, so I would say that.
Okay, well,
Can
let's
I-
leave
can
that
I-
as a difference.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
You said for publicity. It's not just for publicity. Of course, it's to call attention to our news organizations. But I'm in this business to have impact. I want, if I do an investigative if I do an investigative story like the Harvey Weinstein reporting that we just did, I want it to have impact. I want it to be read. I want it to be discussed. I want it to have impact on the world. So yeah, I want the report. And then, by the way, I want people to meet the reporters who did it. I think people benefited from meeting David Fahrenthold and seeing he's like a normal, nice guy.
Okay. Journalists
That's
around
David
the world.
Fahrenthold of the Washington Post. Just to be clear. Just to be clear.
Widening the circle just a minute.
And I feel the same way about the DEA story that we had. So.
Talking seriously for a minute.
Yeah. Do we have to?
We're really serious.
No.
Go ahead.
What I would like to say is that journalists around the world tend to look toward the United States as a beacon for the expression of a free press in its broadest sense. They look toward us for that. And I'm wondering if you think that President Trump's attacks on the press have affected the way other governments deal with their press. Dean?
Well, I want to say one. It's easy for Americans to get so upset about the way Donald Trump attacks us that we forget. We still have these amazing freedoms that other news organizations don't enjoy. We can still write. Neither one of us controls our editorial pages, but our editorial pages tomorrow can say whatever they want to say. I can publish, a 3-part series about anything. He can rail, he can complain, we can cover that, and we can write an analysis about it. We shouldn't kid ourselves. We have remarkable freedom in this country.
I totally agree with that. I
But
want
yes,
to protect it.
But yes, I do. I think it's almost inevitable, and there's been some reported evidence of it, that if the President of the United States feels comfortable saying the list of despicable things that Marty described that this president has said about journalists, that's got to be empowering to countries that look for excuses to beat up their journalists, and by the way, to beat us up too. It's a little bit hard for me, as we keep making the case to the Chinese government that they should make our website more available, which they shut down after we did an investigative piece, if the President of the United States is trashing us all over the place, that's for sure.
Marty, one of your reporters, Jason Rezaian, who was right here with us tonight, I'm happy to say, was captive in Iran for 544 days. And we're so happy that he is now a free man and a free journalist once again. But how do you editors protect reporters who are in similar, dangerous, very troubling environments?
Well, it's very difficult. We try to take every precaution possible. We try to know where our reporters are at any time. We provide security counseling all along the way. What happened to Jason was horrible, and totally unexpected. It came out of the blue for us. And that's not where we perceived the greatest risk at the time. We're very concerned about reporters who are covering Syria, reporters who were in Iraq, who were in Afghanistan, in places like that. Now, journalists who may be operating in Turkey, because Turkey has actually cracked down on the press, including the foreign press. And so we get concerned about that. journalists who are operating in Mexico, where journalists are assassinated, domestic journalists are assassinated on a regular basis. Journalists in Venezuela, where journalists are imprisoned on a regular basis. So we're concerned about the security of our people who operate in those environments. We do have people who advise us, experts who advise us on security. We keep track of our journalists' movements so that we know where they are.
If one of them was kidnapped and you had a ransom request of $5 million, would you pay it?
Well, these are the hypotheticals that we would never discuss as to what we would do and how we would respond to anything of that sort. We just are not going to. I'm not going to discuss that.
Okay. One student from the University of Oklahoma, who is with us tonight, asked me to ask you this question. It's a wonderful question. She wanted to know whether we're all going through a kind of temporary phase in our American democracy with President Trump, and that when he leaves office, whenever that be, we'll all return to something that resembles a normal presidency and a normal America. So what do you think about that, Dean?
I don't know, but I would say a couple things. I think that Washington and the press and the government will be different in a post-Trump era. I think that there's just no question. I don't think, let's say Donald Trump is president for 8 years. I don't think that the next president comes in and all of the changes that have been made, all of the debates that have been had. And by the way, the one thing I would add, those debates, many of those debates are the reason he was elected. I don't think those debates are there are fierce debates in the country about the role of the media, the role of the elite, the role of the coasts, and those debates are going to still go on. And I think if we pretend that Donald Trump is not a product of those debates, we're going to miss the opportunity to really monitor and understand a discussion that was going on in the country before him, and my guess is will go on after him. He's a byproduct, whatever one thinks of him, and I'm not going to judge him, that's not my job. He is a byproduct of some fierce debates and economic upheavals in America that are not going to go away.
Let me ask each of you a final question, and I'm going to give you, as we say in television terms, 30 seconds to answer it. I want a detailed answer. Seriously, what kind of advice would you give to young journalists in the audience here, or to students who want to go into journalism, given sort of the negativity, whatever, going on today? What would you tell them? What advice? Marty, start.
It's short and sweet. Go into it. Go into journalism. It's a great profession. It's going to have a future. I'm an optimist, actually, notwithstanding the enormous challenges we face. One person, it's a great field. One person can make an enormous difference. Absolutely. One person. And if you want to be the person who can make an enormous difference, it's a great field to go into.
Dean.
This is the greatest time to be a journalist. Look, I grew up in a world where there was one platform, print. I called Max Frankel. I sent Max Frankel a note one day saying, my God, I just ordered up a video. There's no question that the best news organizations are like 1 billion times better than they ever were before, and that the opportunities are greater.
Thank you both very much. I'm afraid that our time is up for now, running out of time. But in closing, forgive me, but I'd like to go back to an earlier point about the relationship of a free press to political authority. And I'd like to say that in my career as a journalist, I spent a lot of time covering the Soviet Union. It was a country at that time governed by communists. They had little taste or understanding of personal freedom, much less press freedom. Everything was determined by the vozhd, the Russian word for the master leader, the guy who ran everything from the Kremlin, who thought he knew more than anyone else, and as a result, everyone from doctors to journalists had to stand up and salute, never rock the boat, never be critical of him or of his policies. I did not like that arbitrary style of governance then, or any version of it, and I don't like it now. What I've learned over the years is that only a free press can truly protect us from authoritarian government. Only a free press can ensure a continuation of a vibrant democracy. The two are inseparable. If a political leader, for whatever reason, finds it to his advantage to attack a free press, to humiliate it, to disparage it, he is really attacking democracy at its core, and that has no place in this country. At least that is my view. Let me now thank our audience here at the National Press Club and all over the world, and especially I want to thank our two editors, Marty Baron of the Washington Post, Dean Baquet of the New York Times, for taking the time to be with us, for sharing their thoughts, ideas, experience with us, and for giving us hope that their leadership will inspire a new generation of reporters to go out there and get the news without fear or favor. But that's it for now. I'm Marvin Kalb, and as Ed Murrow used to say many years ago, good night and good luck.